I'm going to need you to step back from the counter, ma'am, right now. 11 words, spoken with the practiced sweetness of someone who has made this exact demand before, to women who look exactly like the one standing 3 feet away. The fluorescent lights of Grove's family pharmacy hummed their endless mechanical song overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes healthy skin look sallow and tired, faces look dead. The prescription bag sat on the counter, close enough to touch, far enough to be withheld. Nadine Hollister did not step back. She did not step forward either. She simply stood, feet shoulder-width apart, hands resting on the laminate surface where 1,000 other customers had placed their palms, while waiting for medications that would ease their pain, regulate their hearts, quiet the storms in their minds. Her posture carried the particular stillness of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided to let it happen anyway. The woman behind the counter, Marlena Groves, according to the embroidered name on her white coat, held a cordless phone in her left hand. The call had already been placed. The words already spoken into the void of emergency dispatch, words that would later become evidence in a case that would dismantle careers and expose rot that had been festering for years. The 911 recording would be played in courtrooms and conference rooms and congressional hearings. It would be dissected by legal analysts and civil rights advocates and journalists who specialize in the particular American tragedy of black bodies in white spaces. But right now, in this moment, it was simply a voice crackling through a dispatcher's headset 43 miles away. Cartersville Emergency Services. Call logged 3:41 p.m., April 14, 2024. Caller identification: Grove's Family Pharmacy, 1847 Bellwood Drive. And then Marlena's voice, slightly muffled, as though she had turned away from the phone to watch her target while she spoke. There's a woman here acting erratic. Black female, mid-30s. She's demanding controlled substances. I think she might be on something. Sumatriptan. That was what Nadine had come for. A migraine medication, not a controlled substance, not even close. The kind of prescription that required nothing more than a valid script and functional insurance, both of which she possessed. But the call had already been made, the words already recorded, the machinery of response already grinding into motion. Nadine's hand moved toward her jacket pocket, slow, deliberate. Her fingers found the edge of something rectangular, something that would matter later but not yet. She did not pull it out. Instead, she checked her watch. A simple digital model with a heart rate function. 72 beats per minute. Calm. Measured. The pulse of someone who had been in situations far more dangerous than a pharmacy counter in suburban Georgia. The security camera in the corner blinked red. Recording. But so was something else. 3 minutes. That was how long before sirens would fill the parking lot. She knew the response time for this precinct better than anyone in the building, including the officer already en route. The morning had started the way most of her mornings started now, before dawn, in an apartment that held no photographs and displayed no diplomas, where the only personal touch was a whiteboard calendar covered in color-coded blocks. The blocks were labeled with initials rather than words, Dr. FCWI. To anyone glancing through her window, they might have represented anything: dental appointments, fitness classes, work meetings. They did not represent any of those things. 6:15 a.m. Coffee measured precisely. 2 tablespoons, medium grind, 175-degree water. The ritual of preparation serving as meditation, as centering, as the daily reminder that discipline was the foundation upon which everything else was built. A worn copy of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure sat on the kitchen counter, spine cracked from use, currently serving as a coaster for the coffee mug she had owned for 11 years. Her phone buzzed against the granite. A text from a contact saved simply as MT. Deposition rescheduled. New docs incoming, she replied with a thumbs-up emoji. No names, no details. Nothing that would mean anything to someone who happened to glance at her screen. Then she finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and placed it upside down on the drying rack at a precise 45-degree angle. The same angle every morning, the same position every time, the kind of habit that spoke to years of training in environments where consistency meant survival. The drive from Atlanta took 47 minutes when traffic cooperated. Today it cooperated. Interstate 20 west to Highway 27 south, then the two-lane roads that wound through pine forests and past churches with those signs out front advertising Sunday service times and Wednesday night prayer meetings. The county line appeared at mile marker 31, a green rectangle welcoming visitors to Carroll County, population 22,847. She had crossed that line twice a week for 3 months now. Becoming a face, building a pattern, establishing the kind of presence that made people stop paying close attention. Cartersville itself was a town caught between two worlds. New coffee shops with exposed brick and reclaimed wood furniture sat next to shuttered textile factories whose windows had been dark for decades. The gentrification was visible in the parking lots, Teslas and BMWs sharing space with 20-year-old pickup trucks and minivans held together by prayer and duct tape. Flags decorated front porches throughout the residential streets, declarations of allegiance that spoke to the fault lines running beneath the surface of small-town American life. She pulled into the pharmacy parking lot at 3:32 p.m., early enough to seem like a routine stop, late enough in the afternoon that the staff would be tired, their patients worn thin by hours of insurance disputes and prescription complications. Grove's Family Pharmacy occupied the end unit of a strip mall that had seen better days, a nail salon, a tax preparation service, a store that advertised gold-buying services with hand-lettered signs taped to the window. The pharmacy was the anchor tenant, the business that kept the lights on in the other units, the reason anyone drove to this particular intersection in the first place. She had been here before, 8 times over the past 12 weeks, each visit documented in memory rather than writing. Never writing, not here, not anything that could be found if someone decided to look through her belongings. The dates lived in her head alongside the times, the witnesses, the small indignities that accumulated like interest on a debt no one wanted to acknowledge. The first visit had established the pattern. She had walked through the automatic doors, presented her prescription from an Atlanta doctor, and waited while Marlena Groves examined it like a customs agent studying a passport at a high-security checkpoint. "This is from an Atlanta doctor," Marlena had said. Not a question. An accusation disguised as observation. "We usually see local prescriptions here." "My insurance covers this location." Marlena had processed the prescription. Slowly. She had asked for 2 forms of identification. She had scrutinized the driver's license photograph as though comparing it to a wanted poster. She had entered the information into her computer with the deliberate pace of someone hoping the customer would give up and leave. Nadine had not given up, had not left, had simply waited, hands visible on the counter, posture relaxed but alert, until the prescription was filled and the bag was handed over with a smile that carried all the warmth of a January frost. The subsequent visits had followed variations of the same script, being asked to wait while white customers who had arrived after her were served first, being asked to verify her address twice when the prescription label already displayed it correctly, being watched by the security guard, a retired cop named Earl whose belly strained against his uniform shirt, as though she might pocket the impulse buy candy bars near the register. Each indignity noted, each date recorded, each piece of a larger pattern that she was here to document. Today's visit was supposed to be routine. Pick up the monthly refill, document any irregularities, return to Atlanta with one more data point in a file that was growing thicker by the week. The bell chimed as she entered. Earl straightened from his lean against the blood pressure machine, his eyes tracking her movement the way they always did, not obviously, not in a way that would hold up as evidence of anything specific, but with the unmistakable attention of someone who had decided she required watching. She approached the counter. Marlena was on the phone, not with a customer, not with the insurance company, but with someone whose voice carried urgency even at low volume. Fragments drifted across the 6 feet of space between them. "Same one from before." "No, she's here again." "Yes, I'll keep her occupied." The phone returned to its cradle. The smile appeared, painted on like stage makeup. "Oh, Ms. Hollister, "You're early today." She was not early. Her appointments, her prescriptions, followed the same schedule every month, the same day, the same approximate time. The claim of earliness was a seed, planted for later harvest, establishing the narrative that something was off about this particular visit. "I'm here to pick up my prescription, Hollister, Hollister. Marlena turned to the alphabetized bins behind her, found the bag, small, white, stapled at the top, held it in her hands rather than placing it on the counter. "There's a problem with your insurance verification. I need to call it in. I verified coverage this morning. Confirmation number 742 Alpha Tango." The smile tightened. Insurance companies did provide confirmation numbers for coverage verification. Customers did occasionally write them down and bring them to pharmacies, but customers did not typically recite them from memory with alphanumeric precision, the way someone might recite a case file number or a federal statute citation. "I'll still need to verify. Company policy. Please step aside." Please step aside. Not please wait. Not let me check on this. Step aside. Clear the space. Make room for the customers who belonged there. Remove yourself from the counter where legitimate transactions occurred. "I'd like to speak with the pharmacist, please." "Dr. Ansel Chen. He filled this prescription last month." "Oh, Chen isn't available." Through the glass partition separating the front counter from the dispensary, a figure in a white coat moved among the shelves. Male. Asian. The pharmacist whose name appeared on every prescription label this pharmacy produced. Dr. Chen was 12 feet away, visible to anyone who cared to look, pretending very hard not to notice the conversation occurring at the front of his store. "I can see him in the back." The moment stretched. Marlena's hand moved below the counter, to a button, to a phone, to whatever mechanism existed for summoning assistance when a customer refused to play her assigned role in this particular performance. "Ma'am, I'm asking you one more time. Step back from the counter." 11 words, spoken with the practiced sweetness of someone who had made this exact demand before. And now, sirens approaching, growing louder by the second, responding to a call that had been placed before Nadine ever reached the register. If you're already hooked by where this is heading, tap that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens when they realize who they're really dealing with. The patrol car entered the parking lot with the particular aggressive acceleration that announced its presence before the sirens fully registered. Tires chirping on asphalt. Engine revving. The choreography of arrival designed to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. Nadine watched through the pharmacy's plate glass windows as the vehicle swung into a parking space directly in front of the entrance. Not a handicapped space, but close enough to the doors that the message was clear. Whoever was inside this car owned this situation. The rules would be whatever he decided they were. The driver's door opened, heavy boots on pavement, a figure unfolding from behind the wheel with the kind of deliberate slowness that communicated confidence, authority, and something else. Something that looked like anticipation. Officer Blaine Vickers stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed approximately 230 pounds, most of it distributed across shoulders that strained his uniform shirt and a torso that suggested regular attention to the weight room. 11 years on the force. 3 excessive force complaints in his personnel file, all ruled unfounded by investigators who had never seemed particularly interested in the findings they were required to produce. A wedding ring tan line on his left hand, but no ring. The ghost of a marriage that had ended sometime in the past year, leaving behind whatever resentments accompany that particular kind of failure. His right hand rested on his duty belt. Not on his weapon, not yet, but close enough that the gesture carried its intended message. The automatic doors parted. The bell chimed. And Blaine Vickers stepped into Grove's family pharmacy like a man walking onto a stage where he had performed many times before. "What's the problem here?" The question was directed at Marlena, not at Nadine. The assumption of the answer already embedded in the asking. Whatever the problem was, It was standing at the counter wearing brown skin and an expression of calm that did not match the script. Marlena's performance shifted into a register reserved for authority figures. "This woman won't leave. She's been harassing my staff, demanding drugs." Drugs, not medication, not prescription. Drugs, the word that conjured specific images, specific fears, specific justifications for whatever came next. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the counter." The directive landed in the space between them. Nadine did not step away, did not move at all. Simply stood with her hands visible, her posture neutral, her pulse, she checked her watch again, holding steady at 74 beats per minute. "Oh, I'm a customer attempting to pick up a valid prescription. I haven't been asked to leave, and I haven't refused any lawful request." Vickers' jaw tightened. The words she had chosen were specific. Lawful request, the kind of phrasing that lawyers used, the kind of language that could become evidence in depositions and courtrooms and civil rights complaints. "I'm asking you now, under what authority?" 3 words, simple, direct. The question that officers were trained to answer but rarely required to address, because most people in most situations did not ask it. Most people stepped back when told to step back. Most people produced identification when demanded. Most people understood, correctly, that the power differential in these encounters meant that resistance carried costs, that compliance was the safer path, that whatever rights existed on paper did not always translate into protection in practice. Nadine Hollister was not most people. "Under the authority of the badge, ma'am. Now step back." I'd like to understand the specific legal basis for that instruction. Am I suspected of committing a crime? Vickers' hand moved from his belt to his radio. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable. Backup being summoned, the situation being escalated, the machinery of force being assembled. "I'm conducting an investigation." "Into what specific offense?" "Trespassing." "You've been asked to leave and you refused." The charge was constructed from available materials, shaped to fit the situation rather than the facts. Trespassing required notice. A request to leave, communicated clearly, with an opportunity to comply. No such request had been made. The instruction to step aside was not the same as an instruction to leave. The distinction mattered, legally. Whether it would matter practically remained to be seen. "Actually, I wasn't asked to leave. I was asked to step aside. Those are different requests with different legal implications. Additionally, Mrs. Groves isn't the property owner. According to county records, this building is leased from Bellwood Commercial Properties. The authority to issue trespass warnings rests with the property owner or their designated agent, and I haven't seen documentation establishing that Mrs. Groves holds that designation." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Earl, the security guard, shifted his weight, uncomfortable with a conversation that had moved beyond his understanding. Marlena's painted smile flickered, and Vickers reached for his radio with a motion that no longer carried anything resembling subtlety. "Unit 7 requesting backup at Groves Pharmacy. 1 female subject, possible 1016. 1016. The code designation for mental health crisis. The classification that transformed a prescription pickup into a psychiatric emergency. The justification that would later be cited for whatever use of force followed, framed as necessary intervention to protect the subject from herself." "I'm not experiencing a mental health crisis, officer. I'm asking clarifying questions about the legal basis for your instructions. Those are different things." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down." "I am calm. If you'd like verification of that, my watch displays real-time heart rate data. Currently reading 74 beats per minute, which falls within the normal resting range for an adult female." She showed him the watch face, the number glowing green against the black display. Evidence, small but concrete, that her physiological state did not match the narrative being constructed around her. Vickers did not look at the watch. His attention had shifted to the parking lot where a second patrol car was pulling in. Backup arriving. Reinforcements for a situation that involved a woman standing still at a pharmacy counter, asking questions about legal procedure. Sergeant Trey Beckford, emerged from the second vehicle with the measured pace of a man accustomed to arriving after the initial contact had been established. Mid-40s, careful eyes, the bearing of someone who had spent years learning to look concerned while doing as little as possible to justify that concern. 3 stripes on his sleeve marking his rank. Vickers' direct supervisor on the duty roster, the person responsible for reviewing his reports, approving his overtime, handling the complaints that occasionally surfaced before they could metastasize into actual consequences. What do we have, Blaine? Trespassing, refusing lawful orders, possible 1016. The categories stacked on top of each other like building blocks, each one adding weight to the structure being assembled. Beckford's gaze moved from Vickers to Nadine, assessing. Ma'am, why don't we step outside and talk about this calmly? The suggestion was phrased as an invitation. It was not an invitation. Outside meant away from the security cameras recording this interaction. Outside meant away from the witnesses, the other customers who had pressed themselves against the walls, phones in pockets where they might or might not be recording. Outside meant a space where the narrative could be shaped more freely. I'm happy to discuss this inside, where there are witnesses and security cameras. I believe that's in everyone's best interest. Beckford's gaze flicked to the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, then back to Vickers. A look passed between them. Brief, practiced, the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who have coordinated their actions many times before. Vickers' hand moved to his chest. His body camera. The small black device that was supposed to provide accountability, to record interactions, to create a record that could be reviewed if questions arose later. The red light that had been blinking since his arrival was now dark. Technical difficulties with your equipment, Officer Vickers? Beckford asked the question with a tone that suggested he already knew the answer. Battery must have died, Sarge. Georgia law requires body camera activation during all citizen contacts. Specifically, that's outlined in OCGA Section 35-1-10, which establishes training and equipment standards for peace officers. She should not know that statute. A project manager would not know that statute. A customer picking up a migraine prescription would not cite Georgia code from memory with the precision of someone reading from a legal brief. Beckford noticed. Filed the observation away for later consideration. Blaine, make sure to note the equipment malfunction in your report. We'll want it to take a look at that unit. The fiction established. The paper trail prepared. Whatever happened next would occur in the gap between what the cameras showed and what the reports claimed, in the space where accountability went to die. That's it. You're coming with me. Vickers moved forward. His hand reached for Nadine's arm, not asking permission, not providing warning, simply taking hold as though her body was his to position and control. Am I under arrest? You're being detained for investigation. Then please state the specific crime you're investigating and the articulable facts that give you reasonable suspicion, as required under Terry v. Ohio. The case citation landed with force. Terry v. Ohio, the Supreme Court decision establishing the standards for investigative detention. The ruling that every law enforcement officer learned in the academy that defined the boundaries between lawful investigation and unconstitutional seizure. She was not just asking questions anymore, she was citing precedent. Vickers' hand tightened on her wrist, his fingers pressing into flesh with more force than any lawful detention required. She did not pull away. That would be resisting. That would provide justification. That would become the story told in courtrooms and internal reviews. Instead, she went still. Passive wait. Complete cooperation in every physical dimension, even as her words continued to establish the record. Stop resisting! The command was shouted for the benefit of witnesses, for future reports, for the narrative being constructed. She was not resisting. She was standing absolutely still while his fingers ground against the small bones of her wrist. I am not resisting. I am standing still. There are currently 4 witnesses present in this pharmacy. The time is 4:02 p.m. He twisted her arm behind her back. Something in her shoulder joint protested, not breaking, not tearing, but straining in ways that would leave bruises in the shape of fingerprints. Pain lanced through the joint. She did not cry out, did not flinch, did not give them anything that could be characterized as combative behavior. The handcuffs appeared, cold metal circling her wrists, the ratcheting sound of restraints clicking closed, too tight immediately, cutting into skin with pressure that would leave marks. These cuffs are restricting circulation. I'm formally requesting that you adjust them to a lawful tension level. You can request whatever you want. Beckford stepped forward. Blaine, adjust them. The intervention was minimal, just enough to appear on any future report as supervisory oversight, as correction of subordinate behavior, as evidence that the chain of command was functioning properly. Vickers loosened the cuffs one notch. They were still too tight. The adjustment was theater, nothing more. You have the right to remain silent. Miranda, finally, the constitutional protection that attached upon custodial interrogation, though technically it was not required until questioning began. The recitation now was prophylactic, defensive, a demonstration that proper procedures were being followed even as those procedures were being violated in a dozen other ways. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. The words rolled out with the mechanical rhythm of repetition, sounds stripped of meaning through overuse. Vickers guided her toward the door, not gently, not carefully, but with pressure applied to the restraints in a way that made every step uncomfortable. Earl held the door open. His expression carried something that might have been satisfaction, might have been discomfort, might have been the blank neutrality of a man who had learned not to see things that complicated his continued employment. The parking lot was bright with afternoon sun. The patrol car waited, back door already open. The plastic rear seat visible, hard surface designed to be cleaned easily to resist the various fluids that accumulated during transport, to provide as little comfort as possible to the human cargo it carried. No seatbelt was offered. The door closed with a heavy thunk. Through the window, Nadine watched Grove's family pharmacy shrink as the vehicle pulled away. Marlena stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her white coat, watching the departure with the satisfied expression of someone whose plan had worked exactly as intended. The encrypted phone was still in Nadine's purse, which Vickers had seized along with her other personal effects. The battery backup recording device sewn into the lining of her jacket remained active, its tiny microphone capturing every word, every sound, every piece of the interaction that would later become evidence. Everything since she entered the pharmacy was preserved, every violation documented, every procedure ignored, every lie told for the benefit of future reports that would claim this detention was lawful, necessary, and conducted with full respect for constitutional rights. The siren remained silent as they drove. No need for urgency. The emergency had been manufactured, and the machinery of processing would proceed at whatever pace served the interests of those controlling it. Chatham. Carroll County Sheriff's Station occupied a building that had last been renovated during the Reagan administration. Gray walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, the smell of industrial cleaning products failing to mask decades of accumulated human misery. Nadine had studied photographs of this facility during her research. Being inside it now, she noted the details that photographs could not capture. The temperature set too cold for comfort, the echo of voices against hard surfaces, the way the layout forced detainees to pass a gauntlet of desks staffed by officers who watched each new arrival with assessment bordering on appetite. Booking occurred at a window that resembled a bank teller's station, complete with bulletproof glass and a circular speaker through which communication occurred. A young officer on the other side, fresh-faced, probably less than 2 years on the job, pulled up forms on his computer and began entering information. Name? Nadine Hollister, Hollister. Date of birth? She provided it. Along with her address, her social security number, the information requested for processing a human being into the machinery of incarceration. Charges? Vickers answered before she could respond. OCGA Section 16-7-21, Criminal Trespass. OCGA Section 16-11-39, Disorderly Conduct. OCGA. Section 16-10-24, Subdivision A, Obstruction. The booking officer typed slowly, eyes moving between Vickers and his keyboard, entering the charges as dictated rather than as verified. "I'd like those specific charges documented with the relevant statutory elements, please, for the record." The young officer's fingers paused above the keys. He looked to Vickers for guidance, the reflex of someone trained to defer to seniority, to follow the chain of command, to accept instruction rather than exercise independent judgment. "Just enter what I said." Obstruction requires knowingly and willfully hindering an officer in the lawful discharge of official duties. I'd like the record to reflect what specific lawful duty was allegedly obstructed and what actions of mine constituted knowing and willful hindrance. Silence. The booking officer waited. Vickers's jaw worked, the muscles tightening and releasing as he processed the reality that this detainee was not following the expected script. "Process her." The forms were completed, the personal effects logged: wallet, phone, keys, notebook, the prescription receipt that had started everything. Each item cataloged with a description, a photograph, a place in the system that would hold them until release or trial, or whatever other disposition awaited. The holding area occupied the rear of the facility, accessible through a series of doors that required badge access and created a progression of decreasing freedom with each threshold crossed. The cell that received Nadine was 8 feet by 6 feet, containing a concrete bench, a stainless steel toilet with no privacy partition, and graffiti scratched into paint by previous occupants. Names, dates, obscenities. The archaeological record of people who had passed through this space and left their marks as evidence of existence. She sat on the concrete bench. The cold seeped through her clothing immediately, a discomfort that was not accidental. The design of holding cells, the temperature, the lighting, the absence of softness or comfort, served purposes beyond simple containment. Discomfort wore down resistance. Physical misery created psychological vulnerability. The environment itself was a tool, applied with the precision of long practice. Hours passed. The lights did not dim. The temperature did not change. No phone call was offered, a violation of OCGA Section 17-4-62, which required reasonable access to communication. She did not request one. Asking created one kind of record. Being denied without asking created another kind of record, one of neglect rather than refusal, harder to dismiss as bureaucratic misunderstanding. At what her internal clock estimated was approximately midnight, 7 hours after arrival, footsteps approached. Heavy, deliberate. The tread of someone who had authority and intended to use it. Lieutenant Harold Peniston appeared at the cell door, silver at the temples, soft voice, the manner of command that had learned not to shout because shouting was unnecessary when people understood the power behind the quiet words. He wore civilian clothes, slacks and a golf shirt, the uniform of a man called in from personal time to address a situation that required his particular attention. "Miss Hollister, I understand there's been some confusion today." The word choice was precise. Confusion, not conflict, not wrongdoing, not violation of rights. Just confusion. A simple misunderstanding that reasonable people could resolve with reasonable conversation. "There's been no confusion, Lieutenant. There's been false arrest, excessive force, and denial of due process. Each of those is a distinct category of constitutional violation, and each is documented." Peniston's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The assessment recalculating. Most people in this situation, frightened, tired, isolated, responded to authority with deference. They accepted the olive branch of confusion because the alternative was admitting that something much worse had occurred. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Mrs. Groves has a right to refuse service. She didn't refuse service. She withheld a valid prescription while simultaneously fabricating a 911 call claiming I was demanding controlled substances. Sumatriptan is not a controlled substance under federal or state scheduling guidelines. It's an anti-migraine medication available by standard prescription. The false report itself constitutes a violation of OCGA Section 16-10-26, false report of a crime. The statute citation hung in the air. Peniston was not a lawyer. He did not have every criminal code section memorized. But he knew enough to recognize when someone was speaking with the precision of legal training, when the conversation had shifted from civilian complaint to potential counter-prosecution. "I think we can work this out." His voice softened further, became almost paternal in its reasonable warmth. "Charges could be dropped, if you agree to avoid that particular pharmacy going forward." The offer seemed generous on its surface. Walk away. Forget this happened. Accept a restriction on behavior in exchange for freedom from prosecution. Reasonable people accepted such offers. Reasonable people recognized the power imbalance and chose the path of least resistance. That sounds like a condition for release that isn't authorized by the magistrate. It also has characteristics consistent with witness tampering, using the threat of prosecution to discourage future testimony about the underlying events. Peniston's reasonable warmth evaporated. What replaced it was harder, colder, the face beneath the mask. "I'm trying to help you." "No, you're not." The words fell between them like a door closing. Peniston studied her for a long moment, really looked, perhaps for the first time, seeing something that had not been visible when she was simply another arrest, simply another body in the system, simply another problem to be managed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm documenting the facts as they occur. The difficulty comes from the facts themselves, not from my observation of them." He left without another word. The footsteps receded down the corridor. The fluorescent lights continued their endless hum. And Nadine Hollister sat on the concrete bench, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the next move in a game that had been in progress for far longer than tonight. Chapter 3. This story is just getting started. If you want to see what happens when the truth comes out, hit that like button and stick around. The union attorney arrived at hour 12. Darnell Odom moved through the sheriff's station with the easy confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and answered to no one present. His suit was immaculate, charcoal gray, Italian cut, the kind of tailoring that whispered money without shouting it. Gold cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite having walked through a parking lot to reach this building. He was not here for Nadine. He was here for the officers, specifically to ensure that whatever complications arose from this detention would not attach to the people who wore badges and belonged to the police union that paid his considerable retainer. His presence, however, required acknowledgement of her existence. Ms. Hollister. He appeared at her cell as though materialized from the institutional gray of the walls themselves. "I'm just here to ensure due process for all parties." "Including the party currently in handcuffs?" The question carried no heat, simply observation. The cuffs had been removed for processing, but the marks they left remained visible on her wrists, red circles that would darken to purple by morning. Due process is blind. Due process should be. Whether it actually is in practice, that's the question, isn't it? Odom's smile did not waver. He had heard variations of this sentiment countless times, from countless detainees, in countless facilities. The cynicism of the arrested was background noise to him, the static that accompanied his work without requiring response. "Your public defender will be assigned shortly. I trust you'll cooperate fully with the process." "I always cooperate fully with lawful process. I've been cooperating all evening. The record will reflect that cooperation clearly." Something flickered in Odom's expression, the first crack in the professional facade. She was not behaving the way defendants behaved, was not showing the fear or anger or desperation that typically characterized people in her position. The absence of expected emotional response was, itself, data. He would analyze it later, share the assessment with his clients, advise them accordingly. "Get some rest, Ms. Hollister. Tomorrow will be a long day." He departed. The corridor returned to silence, and Nadine closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to process, to organize, to prepare for what came next. The magistrate hearing occurred at 9:15 the following morning, 26 hours after her arrest. The courtroom was small, really just a conference room repurposed for judicial functions, and the magistrate herself seemed to wish she were anywhere else. Too many cases, too little time, the machinery of justice grinding forward with the enthusiasm of workers punching clocks. The state charges criminal trespass, disorderly conduct, and obstruction of justice. How does the defendant plead? Not guilty on all counts. Bond? The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney who had clearly drawn the short straw for magistrate duty, consulted his file. The state requests bond of $5,000. The defendant has no local ties and poses a flight risk. I have an Atlanta address and have lived in Georgia for 7 years. I have no criminal record. The charges stem from an attempt to pick up a prescription at a pharmacy. The flight risk characterization is unsupported by any evidence in the record. The magistrate looked up from her paperwork for the first time. Actually, looked at the defendant standing before her. Whatever she saw prompted a decision that might have gone differently on a different day, with a different defendant, with a different set of circumstances. Released on personal recognizance, the defendant will appear for all scheduled court dates. Next case. The paperwork processed quickly after that. Personal effects returned. Wallet, phone, keys, notebook, even the prescription receipt that had never been filled. Vickers was not present for the release, but his absence did not mean his attention had wandered elsewhere. Outside, the morning sun felt like freedom. Not permanent freedom. The charges remained. The process continued. The system would demand its accounting. But temporary freedom, the ability to move without cuffs, to breathe without surveillance, to think without the oppressive weight of concrete walls. Her car was still in the pharmacy parking lot, impounded, $342 to retrieve it, according to the notice that had been included with her released property. A small additional punishment, one of the countless fees and costs that accumulated around those who pass through the criminal justice system. She called a rideshare instead. Not home, not yet. First, somewhere she could work without observation. The Waffle House sat 14 miles outside Cartersville, at an interchange that served long-haul truckers and travelers who had missed the exit for the chain restaurants closer to the highway. The coffee was adequate. Coffee. The Wi-Fi was functional, and the booth in the corner provided clear sight lines to both entrances while keeping her back to the wall. Her encrypted phone powered on for the first time since the arrest. The battery had survived, a feature, not luck. 11 missed calls, 27 text messages, 4 encrypted emails flagged urgent. She addressed the emails first. The most recent was from Marcus Tyndall, the journalist whose specialty was Freedom of Information Act requests and whose patience for bureaucratic obstruction was legendary among investigative reporters in the Southeast. Subject: FOIA response, Carroll County Sheriff's Dep Complaint Records. Date: April 10, 2024. Ms. Hollister, attached find responsive documents to your request dated February 15th. Note: 12 files were withheld under the personnel exemption cited in OCGA, Section 50-18-72. However, I've cross-referenced with civil court records available through the state database. Officer Blaine Vickers appears in 7 civil lawsuits since 2019. All settled. Terms sealed. 7 civil lawsuits. 7 families or individuals who had experienced something at Vickers' hands significant enough to sue over. 7 settlements with sealed terms, meaning money had changed hands, silence had been purchased, and nothing that might damage his career had entered the public record. She opened the attached documents. Complaint summaries, heavily redacted. Dates visible. Outcomes visible, unfounded, 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 repeating like a legal incantation against accountability. And at the bottom of each investigation report, a signature line for the approving supervisor, Sergeant Trey Beckford, the same man who had arrived at the pharmacy yesterday, the same man who had watched Vickers deactivate his body camera without comment, the same man who had supervised the complaints against his subordinate and found each one lacking merit. Pattern recognition was not technically a skill she could list on a resume, but she had spent enough years reading files, identifying connections, building cases that could withstand defense attorneys and skeptical judges to recognize a pattern when it formed in front of her. The second attachment in Marcus's email was smaller but more immediately relevant: a digital evidence log obtained through the same FOIA request. Carroll County Sheriff's Department Digital Evidence Log, Case Number 2024 CF0312, Body Camera Activation. Officer Vickers, Badge 447. Recording start, 3:54 p.m. Recording end, 4:07 p.m. Note: 13-minute gap detected between 4:07 p.m. and 4:20 p.m. Status: technical malfunction under review. 13 minutes missing. The exact window that covered transport from the pharmacy to the station. The exact period during which she had been placed in the patrol car with no seatbelt, driven through streets she could not see from her position, delivered to booking with wrists already marked by cuffs that had been applied too tightly. Technical malfunction. The explanation that required no further investigation, no disciplinary consequence, no acknowledgement that equipment failures during citizen contacts occurred with suspicious frequency when those citizens later filed complaints. She opened the folder on her laptop that she did not access in public places. The folder that contained 14 months of documentation, organized by date and category and evidentiary value. Case File CR 2024-0847. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Pattern or Practice Investigation. Subject: Carroll County Sheriff's Department. Filed pursuant to 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. Her name appeared on the filing documents. Lead attorney. The person responsible for building the case that would determine whether federal intervention was warranted, whether consent decrees would be imposed, whether the machinery of local law enforcement would be forced to submit to external oversight. 14 months she had been building this case. 14 months of document review and witness interviews and surveillance of public activities. 14 months of becoming a face in Cartersville, the woman who showed up at the diner, the customer who filled prescriptions at the local pharmacy, the unremarkable presence that no one looked at twice. Until yesterday, when the target of her investigation had arrested her without realizing who she was or why she had been watching. The irony was not lost on her. She had come to document civil rights violations, and the department had obligingly provided her with fresh evidence, evidence that she had captured personally, evidence that bore her name as both investigator and victim. But there was one name in the file that was not connected to any active complaint. One victim whose case had never been opened because the victim was no longer alive to file it. Keisha Whitmore. 34 years old at the time of her death. Traffic stop on November 12, 2023, during which she claimed, in the complaint she filed afterward, that Officer Blaine Vickers had used excessive force during the arrest, striking her head against the hood of her car while applying handcuffs. The complaint was assigned to Internal Affairs for investigation. The investigator was Sergeant Trey Beckford. 17 days later, Keisha Whitmore's car left Highway 27 at a curve that she had driven countless times before. Single vehicle accident. No witnesses. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation closed the case in 48 hours with a finding of driver error, operating at excess speed, losing control, failing to navigate a turn that appeared straightforward in daylight. The accident report was in the file, so was the vehicle inspection, obtained through considerable effort and against considerable resistance. One sentence in that inspection stood out. Brake lines showed unusual wear pattern consistent with prior damage. Prior damage. Not defined further, not investigated further. Just a sentence that might mean nothing, or might mean everything, sitting in a file that no one was supposed to read because the record's retention schedule had supposedly destroyed it. Nadine had requested the accident report directly from Carroll County. Denied. Records destroyed per retention schedule. She had requested the vehicle inspection from the GBI. Denied. Investigation closed. No pending litigation. No basis for release. She had obtained both documents through other means that she was not obligated to disclose, but that would hold up under courtroom scrutiny when the time came. 17 days. That was the gap between Keisha filing her complaint and Keisha dying in circumstances that bore investigation. 17 days during which someone knew she was going to testify. 17 days during which her complaint sat in Beckford's queue, waiting for the investigation that would never be completed because the complainant would be permanently unavailable. The connection was circumstantial. Correlation did not equal causation. People had car accidents for many reasons that had nothing to do with pending civil rights complaints against local law enforcement. But the pattern recognition that was not on her resume screamed that this was not coincidence, that Keisha Whitmore had died because she had filed a complaint, that someone in Carroll County had decided her silence was worth purchasing at the ultimate price. And now Nadine had been arrested by the same officer, processed by the same supervisor, subjected to the same machinery that had failed Keisha at every point where it might have provided protection. The coffee in front of her had gone cold. Outside, the traffic on the highway continued its endless flow, trucks and cars and RVs passing the interchange without awareness of the woman in the Waffle House booth, reviewing documents that would eventually reshape their county's entire law enforcement structure. She closed the laptop. The investigation would continue. The case would be built. But today, she was going to do something that was not in the strategic plan, something that served no evidentiary purpose, something that was simply necessary. She was going to let them know that she knew. The Carroll County Sheriff's Station looked different in daylight. Less menacing, more mundane. A brick building with American and Georgia flags hanging limp in the still air. A parking lot half full of patrol vehicles and personal cars. The kind of building that could be a tax office or a DMV branch, institutional in its anonymity. Nadine parked in the visitor lot, walked through the front entrance instead of the side door that detainees used, approached the front desk where a civilian employee looked up from her computer screen with the weary expression of someone who had fielded too many complaints already today. "I'd like to file a formal citizen complaint regarding my detention yesterday." The woman behind the desk reached for a form without changing expression. "Fill this out. Submit it at window 3. You'll receive a tracking number within 5 business days." The form was 4 pages long. Boxes for dates and times and badge numbers. Spaces for narrative descriptions limited to a number of characters that would require condensing the events of 26 hours into a summary suitable for a greeting card. She filled it out at a plastic table against the wall, writing in precise block letters that would be legible on any scan or photocopy. When the form was complete, she carried it to window 3, which turned out to be the same window where she had been processed the night before, now staffed by a different officer who did not recognize her. Complaint against Officer Blaine Vickers. Excessive force, false arrest, denial of due process rights. The officer stamped the form, assigned a tracking number, and provided a receipt with the mechanical efficiency of a DMV transaction. Nothing in his expression suggested awareness that the person filing the complaint had been arrested on this very spot less than 24 hours earlier, but as she turned to leave, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Ms. Hollister, back so soon?" Sergeant Trey Beckford stood in the doorway that led to the station's interior offices. He was in uniform today, crisp, pressed, every element of his appearance professional and beyond reproach. His expression carried the tolerant amusement of a man watching a child engage in futile rebellion. "I'm here to file a formal complaint regarding my detention. That's my constitutional right under the First Amendment and my statutory right under Georgia law." "That's absolutely your right." His smile did not change. "Though I should warn you, frivolous complaints can have consequences. Filing false statements with law enforcement is itself a criminal offense. My complaint contains factual allegations supported by documentary evidence. The characterization of facts as frivolous is itself evidence of bias in the investigative process, which I'll be documenting as well." Beckford's smile remained, but something behind his eyes shifted, the assessment recalculating again. This woman was not behaving the way suspects behaved. was not showing the intimidation that his warning was designed to produce. The absence of expected response was, again, data. She handed him the completed form. Let him see his own name in the narrative section, connected to the body camera malfunction, connected to the approved investigation of Vickers' prior complaints. "I'll make sure this reaches the appropriate investigator." His voice maintained its professional warmth. "I'm certain you will. And Sergeant—" She paused. Let the moment extend. Let the silence create its own weight. Ask Sergeant Beckford what happened to Keisha Whitmore's complaint. The words landed like stones thrown through glass. Beckford's professional mask shattered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. His hand moved involuntarily toward the form, crumpling its edge with sudden pressure. "I don't know anyone by that name. Internal Affairs Case Number IA 2023-0167, filed November 12, 2023. Complainant deceased November 29, 2023, 17 days. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard him reaching for his phone, heard his voice, lower now, speaking to someone whose identity she could not determine, heard the edge of panic that crept into words meant to sound calm. The doors closed behind her. The Georgia sun was warm on her face. And somewhere in the building she had just left, a very careful man was making very rapid calculations about exposure and liability, and the sudden, unwelcome appearance of a name that should have stayed buried. The next 2 weeks moved with the slow grind of institutional processes. Nadine returned to Atlanta, to her apartment that held no photographs, to the work that continued regardless of personal involvement with the subjects of investigation. The complaint she filed generated no immediate response. The tracking number led to an automated system that promised updates within 30 to 60 days. The bureaucracy would process her grievance with the same efficiency it applied to everything else, which was to say, barely any efficiency at all. But other channels were moving. Encrypted communications with Marcus Tyndall, the journalist whose FOIA requests continued to pry documents loose from reluctant agencies. Phone calls with investigators from sister agencies whose work touched tangentially on Carroll County matters. The slow accumulation of confirmation that her pattern recognition had not failed her. On day 12, a new email appeared in her secure inbox. No sender name. The address was a string of numbers routed through anonymizing services. The subject line was blank. The body contained only 3 words. "Call this number." She called from a burner phone purchased with cash. A voice answered on the second ring. "Ms. Hollister, my name is Corinne Pratt. I'm an internal affairs investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I've been assigned to review your complaint. State-level review." That was unusual. Citizen complaints against local officers typically stayed within the department where the alleged conduct occurred. Beckford investigating Vickers, Wolves investigating Wolves. The involvement of GBI suggested that someone, somewhere, had flagged this case for heightened attention. "I'd like to meet with you. Off-site." Why off-site? A pause. The sound of careful consideration about how much to reveal. "Because my office may not be secure." They met at a public library in Marietta. Neutral territory, quiet enough for conversation, public enough that any surveillance would be visible. Corinne Pratt was a black woman in her mid-40s, with the careful bearing of someone who had spent years navigating institutions that did not always welcome her presence. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from fighting battles that never quite ended. "You mentioned Keisha Whitmore in your complaint filing." Pratt spread documents on the table between them, the same complaint form Nadine had submitted, now augmented with notes in handwriting she did not recognize. "How do you know that name?" "Does it matter how I know?" "It matters because that case was sealed. Sealed cases don't leak unless someone with access chooses to release them. That's a limited pool of people. I have access to documents through various channels. The source of my information is less important than its accuracy." Pratt studied her across the table. The same assessment that Beckford had performed, that Peniston had performed, that everyone in this process seemed to find necessary when confronting a woman who did not behave according to expected patterns. You're not just a citizen who got arrested picking up a prescription. I'm a citizen who got arrested picking up a prescription. That's factually accurate. It's not complete. Nadine said nothing. Let the silence create its own space. Pratt leaned back in her chair, made a decision that would later prove to have been the pivotal moment in her own career. Keisha Whitmore's case has bothered me since I first read the file. Single vehicle accident, no witnesses, investigation closed in 48 hours. The brake line notation in the vehicle inspection was never followed up. The timing, 17 days after her complaint, was never questioned. And now? Now, someone who obviously knows more than she's saying has walked into my investigation and started asking questions that I've been told not to ask. Pratt's voice dropped. Counselor? Who do you work for? The word slipped out. Counselor. The term of address used for attorneys, for legal professionals, for people whose credentials demanded a certain respect. Pratt caught her own mistake immediately, but the revelation was already made. I mean, ma'am, who do you work for? I work for the people who need answers, the same people you work for, I suspect, when the system functions the way it should. Pratt was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that carried more weight than words would have. The GBI has been asked to review not just your complaint, but the entire pattern of complaints against Officer Vickers. 7 civil suits, all settled, 3 IA complaints, all unfounded. And now an 8th incident, your arrest, with documented body camera failure during the critical window. Who asked for the review? That's where it gets interesting. Pratt gathered her documents, signaling that the meeting was ending. Federal prosecutors from the Northern District of Georgia. They say there's an active investigation they can't discuss, but they want everything we find. Federal prosecutors. The Northern District of Georgia. The jurisdiction that included Carroll County and extended into Atlanta, where Nadine's own office coordinated with local U.S. attorneys on matters of civil rights enforcement. The circles were closing. The investigation she had built over 14 months was beginning to intersect with the investigation that had been triggered by her own arrest. The pattern she had documented from the outside was now generating additional documentation from within. Ms. Hollister, or whatever your name actually is. Pratt stood, gathering her materials. Whatever happens next, be careful. There are people in Carroll County who have managed to bury uncomfortable questions for a very long time. They're not going to appreciate someone digging them back up. I appreciate the warning. It's not a warning, it's a statement of fact. She paused at the library's exit. And for what it's worth, I believe Keisha Whitmore deserved better than she got. I've believed that since I first read her file. Maybe now someone with more resources than me can prove it. The door closed behind her. The library returned to its afternoon quiet, and Nadine sat among the stacks of books, thinking about Keisha Whitmore, about brake lines, about the 17 days between filing a complaint and dying on a highway curve that should have posed no danger at all. You're about to see everything connect. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the moment they realize exactly who they've been dealing with. 6 weeks passed between Nadine's arrest and the administrative hearing scheduled to address her complaint. In that time, the wheels she had set in motion continued turning, slowly, grinding against institutional resistance, but turning nonetheless. The GBI's review expanded beyond her individual complaint to encompass the entire history of misconduct allegations against Vickers and the investigation patterns that had consistently cleared him. Corinne Pratt, despite warnings from superiors about the political sensitivity of the case, continued gathering documentation that would eventually fill 3 bankers' boxes. Marcus Tyndall's FOIA requests generated additional material, email communications between department leadership discussing problem complainants, budget allocations for legal settlements that appeared as generic line items rather than specific payouts. training records that showed officers receiving instruction on body camera deactivation techniques framed as technical troubleshooting. And in Nadine's office in Atlanta, the file that had been building for 14 months grew thicker still. Victim interviews, financial analysis, the patient accumulation of evidence that would support the pattern or practice finding required for federal intervention under 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday in late May. The location was the Carroll County Administrative Building, not a courtroom, not a judicial proceeding, but an internal process governed by county policy rather than state law. The Oversight Board consisted of 3 civilians appointed by the County Commission, empowered to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action, but not to impose it directly. Nadine arrived at 8:30 a.m. The building was smaller than the sheriff's station, cleaner, with the particular institutional aesthetic of local government facilities that had been constructed during the optimistic decades and allowed to age gracefully since. A receptionist directed her to Conference Room B on the 2nd floor, where folding tables had been arranged in a configuration that suggested court but lacked its formal authority. The board members were already seated when she entered. 3 faces, 2 men and 1 woman, all white, all middle-aged, all displaying the patient neutrality of people who had sat through many such proceedings and expected this one to follow the familiar script. Officer Blaine Vickers sat at the respondent's table. His uniform was crisp, his posture perfect, his expression carrying the confidence of a man who had been through this process before and emerged unscathed each time. Beside him, Darnell Odom reviewed documents with the practiced efficiency of a lawyer who knew exactly which objections to raise and when. Sergeant Trey Beckford occupied a seat in the small gallery area, wearing civilian clothes, ostensibly present as a witness, but actually present as a monitor, the eyes of the department watching to ensure that nothing unexpected occurred. And Lieutenant Harold Peniston sat in the back row, his presence unexplained by any official capacity, his attention fixed on the woman now taking her seat at the complainant's table. This hearing will address Civilian Complaint 2024 CC0089, announced the board chair, a man named Daniel Reynolds, whose biography listed 30 years in insurance adjusting before his current community service role. Filed by Nadine Hollister against Officer Blaine Vickers of the Carroll County Sheriff's Department. The allegations include excessive force, false arrest, and denial of due process rights. Ms. Hollister, you may present your statement. She stood. The room was silent except for the hum of the HVAC system pushing recirculated air through vents that needed cleaning. Thank you, Chair Reynolds. Before I begin my statement regarding the events of April 14th, I need to make a disclosure that affects the scope of these proceedings. Reynolds's brow furrowed. Disclosures were not typical in citizen complaint hearings. The script called for allegations, defense responses, and bureaucratic resolution, not legal maneuvering. She opened her briefcase, removed a leather credential holder that had traveled with her for 7 years, through courtrooms and depositions and investigations that had reshaped departments across the Southeast, placed it on the table with the deliberate care of someone revealing a card that changed everything about the game being played. My name is Nadine Hollister. I am a senior trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, Special Litigation Section. For the past 14 months, I have been the lead investigator on case file CR 2024-0847, a pattern or practice investigation into the Carroll County Sheriff's Department, filed pursuant to 34 United States Code Section 12601. The words fell into silence like stones into deep water, the ripples spreading outward, touching every face in the room. Vickers' expression collapsed, the confidence draining away to leave something rawer, more primal, the look of an animal that has suddenly recognized the trap it had walked into willingly. Beckford stood halfway from his seat before catching himself, the motion of someone preparing to flee arrested by the realization that there was nowhere to go. Odom's pen stopped moving. His legal training processed the implications faster than the others. Federal investigation, pattern or practice authority, the apparatus of the Justice Department now officially engaged with a case that had seemed like a routine complaint. Only Peniston remained motionless, his expression unreadable, his stillness the most concerning reaction in the room. My arrest on April 14th was not an isolated incident, Nadine continued, her voice level, professional, every word calibrated for the record being created. It was the 47th documented civil rights violation by this department in the past 36 months. The 47th instance of excessive force, false arrest, evidence tampering, or obstruction of justice committed by officers of this department against citizens of this community. She pulled files from her briefcase, organized, tabbed, color-coded by victim and violation type. The physical evidence of 14 months compressed into paper and ink. I have evidence to present to this board, evidence that goes beyond my personal experience to establish the systematic pattern that brought me to Carroll County in the first place. Reynolds looked to his fellow board members. Neither offered guidance. They were civilians, appointed for community service, equipped to handle he-said-she-said disputes about parking tickets and traffic stops. They were not equipped for federal investigators revealing themselves in the middle of proceedings. The board will hear your evidence, Ms. Hollister, or counselor, or Ms. Hollister is fine. My title is Senior Trial Attorney, but this proceeding doesn't require formal address. She began with the first document. Exhibit 1, Carroll County Emergency Services Call Log, April 14, 2024. Call received at 3:41 p.m. from Groves Family Pharmacy. The caller, Marlena Groves, reported, and I quote, "There's a woman here acting erratic, black female, mid-30s. She's demanding controlled substances." She placed the document in front of the board. Security camera footage from Groves Family Pharmacy, obtained through subpoena, shows that I did not enter the pharmacy until 3:47 p.m., 6 minutes after this call was placed. Mrs. Groves reported my behavior before I arrived to exhibit any behavior at all. The implications settled over the room. A false report, documented. A 911 call describing events that had not yet occurred. The foundation of the entire arrest crumbling under the weight of timestamp evidence. Exhibit 2. Digital evidence log for Officer Vickers' body camera. Recording began at 3:54 p.m. Recording ended at 4:07 p.m. The log notes a 13-minute gap between 4:07 and 4:20 p.m. attributed to technical malfunction. She placed this document beside the first. During this 13-minute gap, I was transported from the pharmacy to the sheriff's station. During this period, no video or audio recording captured the conditions of my transport. The handcuff injuries visible in my booking photograph, documented as Exhibit 3, occurred during this unrecorded window. The booking photograph showed her wrists, red marks circling the skin where metal had pressed too tightly for too long. Evidence of force that exceeded any reasonable application of restraint. Exhibit 4. Internal Affairs complaint records for Officer Blaine Vickers, obtained through federal subpoena. Since 2019, Officer Vickers has been the subject of 7 civil lawsuits alleging excessive force, false arrest, or civil rights violations. All 7 cases were settled with terms sealed. Additionally, 3 formal internal affairs complaints were filed against Officer Vickers during this period. She paused, ensuring the board understood the significance. All 3 complaints were investigated by Sergeant Trey Beckford. All 3 were ruled unfounded. Beckford shifted in his seat. His jaw worked, but he said nothing. Speaking now would only draw more attention to the pattern she was establishing. Exhibit 5. Bank records obtained through federal subpoena. Between 2020 and 2024, Officer Vickers received deposits totaling $47,000 into a secondary account. These deposits correspond temporally with the settlement dates of civil cases in which he was a named defendant. The implication was clear. Settlement money, funds paid by the county to make lawsuits disappear, had somehow found its way into the personal accounts of the officer whose conduct generated those lawsuits. Whether through direct payment, kickback arrangements, or other mechanisms, the financial trail connected official settlements to personal enrichment. Finally, I present evidence regarding a matter that is not directly connected to my arrest, but is central to the pattern this investigation has documented. She removed the last file. Thinner than the others, more carefully handled. Case number IA 2023-0167. Complainant, Keisha Whitmore. Filed November 12, 2023. Allegation, excessive force during traffic stop. The room went absolutely still. Ms. Whitmore alleged that Officer Vickers struck her head against the hood of her vehicle while applying handcuffs. She filed her complaint with Internal Affairs. The case was assigned to Sergeant Beckford for investigation. She placed the complaint document on the table. 17 days later, on November 29, 2023, Keisha Whitmore died in a single-vehicle accident on Highway 27. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation closed the case within 48 hours, attributing the accident to driver error. She placed the GBI accident report beside the complaint. However, the vehicle inspection conducted as part of that investigation noted, and I quote, "Brake lines showed unusual wear pattern consistent with prior damage." She let the words settle. No follow-up investigation of the brake line damage was conducted. No forensic analysis was performed. No connection was drawn between Ms. Whitmore's pending complaint against Officer Vickers and her death 17 days after filing it. Beckford stood. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the silent room. "This is outrageous. She's accusing me of—" "Sergeant Beckford, you are not a party to this hearing." Reynolds' voice carried authority he had not previously demonstrated. "Sit down." "I have a right to defend myself against slander." Nadine's voice remained level. "It's not slander if I can prove it, and I can." She turned back to the board. "Chair Reynolds, I'm also authorized to inform this oversight body that the Department of Justice will be filing a formal complaint tomorrow morning in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. We are seeking a consent decree requiring federal oversight of the Carroll County Sheriff's Department for a minimum of 36 months. Additionally, we are referring specific individuals for potential criminal prosecution under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. The words were technical, legal, precise. They were also devastating. Federal lawsuit, consent decree, criminal prosecution. The apparatus of the Justice Department now officially engaged, its attention focused on this room and the people in it. Reynolds looked to his fellow board members. Both appeared shell-shocked, their volunteer community service suddenly transformed into the front line of a federal civil rights case. This hearing will recess while we consult with county counsel." The board members fled, there was no other word for it, through a side door that led to offices where lawyers presumably waited to explain the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the hearing room, silence stretched. Vickers stared at the table in front of him, the documents that proved his pattern, the evidence that had been accumulating while he continued to believe himself untouchable. Odom was already on his phone, the union's crisis response protocols activating. Beckford had not sat back down. He stood frozen, caught between the need to leave and the inability to move, processing the reality that his name would appear in federal court filings, that his career of covering up misconduct was about to become a matter of public record. Only Peniston moved. He stood slowly, his age visible for the first time in the careful way he pushed himself upright. He walked toward the exit without haste, without apparent concern, with the measured pace of a man who had been through crises before and knew that panic served no purpose. At the door, he paused, turned back to look at Nadine with an expression that might have been respect, might have been calculation, might have been nothing more than the neutral assessment of an adversary who had just revealed unexpected capabilities. Then he left, and Nadine was alone with the men whose careers she had just ended, surrounded by the documents that would ensure they could never harm another citizen the way they had harmed Keisha Whitmore. The investigation was no longer quiet. The pattern was no longer hidden. And the consent decree, the federal oversight that would reshape this department for years to come, was less than 24 hours from becoming official. But sitting in that hearing room, surrounded by evidence and enemies, Nadine thought about Keisha, about the 17 days between complaint and death, about brake lines that showed unusual wear pattern consistent with prior damage, The truth about Keisha's death was still buried. The consent decree would address systemic reform. Criminal referrals would address individual accountability. But somewhere in Carroll County, someone had made a decision about Keisha Whitmore's life. Someone had calculated that her silence was worth the ultimate price. Someone had arranged circumstances that would look like accident, that would close in 48 hours, that would leave no evidence that connected cause to effect. Finding that someone, proving that connection, would require more than pattern or practice analysis. It would require investigation of a different kind entirely. And Nadine Hollister, senior trial attorney, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, had only just begun. The hallway outside Conference Room B smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and anxiety. Nadine stood near the water fountain, reviewing documents on her phone, while the county's legal apparatus scrambled to respond to what had just occurred. Through the frosted glass of the county counsel's office, shadows moved in patterns that suggested urgent conversation, multiple phone calls, the rapid consumption of antacids. 47 minutes passed before the door opened. County Attorney Marcus Webb emerged first. He was 62, silver-haired, with the particular exhaustion of a man whose career had involved cleaning up messes he did not create. Behind him came the three board members, their expressions transformed from the patient neutrality of routine proceedings to the shell-shocked awareness of people who had suddenly become footnotes in federal litigation. "Miss Hollister!" Webb's voice carried the careful modulation of someone who had spent the past hour being advised by lawyers more senior than himself. "The board has decided to suspend these proceedings pending consultation with federal authorities." I expected that would be the decision. "The county is prepared to cooperate fully with any federal investigation." The words sounded rehearsed, probably dictated by whoever had been on the other end of those phone calls. "We take allegations of civil rights violations seriously and are committed to ensuring accountability at all levels." The statement was boilerplate, the kind of language that appeared in press releases and official communications, designed to project concern while committing to nothing specific. But beneath the bureaucratic phrasing, the message was clear. Carroll County was preparing to sacrifice whoever needed sacrificing to make this problem disappear. "I appreciate the county's stated commitment to cooperation. My office will be in contact regarding document preservation requirements and witness availability." Webb nodded. The board members filed past without speaking, their community service suddenly feeling much less voluntary than it had that morning. Reynolds paused at the elevator, looking back at Nadine with an expression that carried something beyond the expected discomfort. "Miss Hollister, for what it's worth, some of us have wondered about these patterns for years. We just didn't have the authority to do anything about it. Now you have federal backing. The question is what you'll do with it." The elevator doors closed before he could respond. Nadine gathered her documents, returned them to the briefcase that had carried 14 months of evidence into this building, and walked toward the exit. The hearing was suspended, but the larger process was only accelerating. Outside, the Georgia sun had climbed toward its midday intensity. Heat shimmered off the parking lot asphalt, creating the illusion of water on surfaces that held only concrete and painted lines. Her rental car waited where she had left it. The impounded vehicle from the pharmacy parking lot had been retrieved, but she had chosen not to drive it today. Too easy to track. Too many opportunities for interference. She was halfway across the lot when footsteps approached from behind. Heavy, deliberate. The tread of someone who wanted to be heard. "Counselor." Vickers' voice carried none of the confidence it had held in the pharmacy, in the patrol car, in the booking area where he had processed her like cargo. What remained was something raw, the voice of a man watching his life collapse in real time. She turned. He stood 10 feet away, uniform still crisp, but his posture suggesting the clothes were wearing him rather than the reverse. His hands hung at his sides, empty, unthreatening, but the look in his eyes held something that made her grateful for the security cameras covering this parking lot. "You think this changes anything?" The question was delivered with the bravado of someone who had spent years believing himself untouchable. The tone, however, betrayed the fear underneath. He was scared. genuinely, viscerally scared of what was coming. This conversation is being recorded by the security camera behind you. I would suggest you step back and consider whether anything you say right now will improve your situation. I don't give a damn about cameras. I know. She met his eyes directly. That's been the problem all along. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, of the pattern she had identified. The body camera deactivations. The 13-minute gaps. The confidence that recording technology could be managed, manipulated, made to serve the narrative he preferred rather than the truth he feared. You have no idea what you've started. I have a very precise idea of what I've started. I've been building toward it for 14 months. He took a step forward, then stopped, his gaze shifting to something over her shoulder. Another car had entered the parking lot, unmarked, federal plates, the kind of vehicle that announced its occupant's authority without requiring explanation. Two figures emerged, dark suits, credentials visible on lanyards, the particular bearing of people who carried federal badges and knew how to use them. Officer Vickers. The lead agent's voice carried the flat professionalism of someone delivering news that would not be welcome. We need you to come with us. There are questions regarding your involvement in case file CR 20-240847. Not an arrest. Not yet. Just questions. The preliminary stage of a process that would eventually determine whether criminal charges were warranted. But the distinction provided little comfort to a man who had spent years believing such questions would never be asked. Vickers looked at Nadine one final time. Whatever he saw in her expression, satisfaction, pity, the neutral assessment of an investigator watching a subject enter the system, it drained the last resistance from his posture. He went with the agents, the unmarked car pulled away, and Nadine stood alone in the parking lot, feeling the weight of what had just begun settling onto her shoulders. The consent decree was still 20 hours from official filing. The criminal referrals were still being processed. The investigation into Keisha Whitmore's death was still in its preliminary stages. But the dominoes were falling, and once they started, they would not stop until every piece of this corrupt machinery had been exposed. 3 days after the hearing, the Department of Justice held a press conference in Atlanta. The setting was deliberate, federal building, flags arranged behind the podium, the visual language of institutional authority deployed to maximum effect. Cameras from every major network filled the press gallery. Reporters clutched notebooks and recording devices, prepared to transmit whatever was announced to audiences across the country. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Catherine Chen, delivered the statement personally. Her presence signaled the significance of the case. AAGs did not typically travel for routine enforcement actions. This was not routine. Today, the Department of Justice is filing a lawsuit against the Carroll County Sheriff's Department in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. Our complaint alleges a pattern or practice of civil rights violations, including excessive force, false arrest, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. The cameras captured every word. The reporters' pens moved across notebooks. The machinery of public accountability engaged in the work it was designed to perform. Our investigation, conducted over 14 months, documented 47 instances of constitutional violations committed by officers of this department. We have identified systematic failures in training, supervision, and internal accountability that allowed these violations to continue unchecked. We are seeking a consent decree requiring federal oversight of the department for a minimum of 36 months. Chen paused, allowing the significance to register before continuing. Additionally, we are referring 11 current and former officers for potential criminal prosecution under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. These referrals include allegations of excessive force, false arrest, and obstruction of justice. Questions erupted from the press gallery. Chen took them methodically, providing the level of detail that would satisfy reporters while protecting the integrity of ongoing investigations. Can you identify any of the officers being referred for prosecution? I cannot discuss individual referrals at this time. The United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia will make charging decisions based on the evidence provided. What prompted this investigation? The Civil Rights Division monitors patterns of complaints against law enforcement agencies nationwide. Carroll County came to our attention through statistical analysis of civil settlements and internal affairs dispositions that suggested systemic problems requiring federal review. The answer was true, but incomplete. It did not mention Nadine's 14 months of undercover observation, did not reference the pharmacy arrest that had accelerated the timeline, did not explain how a federal prosecutor had ended up in handcuffs in a suburban Georgia booking facility. Those details would emerge eventually through court filings and depositions and the inevitable media investigation that followed high-profile civil rights cases. For now, the official narrative served the official purpose: establishing federal authority, signaling accountability, creating the conditions for reform. In her Atlanta apartment, Nadine watched the press conference on her laptop while organizing files for the next phase of work. The consent decree filing was the beginning, not the end. Implementation would require months of negotiation, monitoring, and enforcement. The criminal referrals would generate their own timelines: grand jury proceedings, charging decisions, trials, or plea negotiations. And beneath all of it, the question that had brought her to Carroll County in the first place remained unanswered. What had really happened to Keisha Whitmore? If you're invested in seeing justice served, hit that like button. The next part reveals what really happened to Keisha Whitmore. The federal courthouse in Atlanta occupied a building that projected authority through architecture: marble floors, high ceilings, the particular silence of spaces designed for consequential decisions. United States District Judge Eleanor Henson presided over the consent decree hearing from a bench that placed her physically above the attorneys arguing before her, a visual reminder of the hierarchy that governed these proceedings. 4 months had passed since the initial filing. 4 months of negotiation, documentation, and the grinding work of translating federal authority into specific requirements. The consent decree that emerged from this process ran to 147 pages, covering everything from body camera protocols to use of force policies to civilian complaint review procedures. The court has reviewed the proposed consent decree and finds it to be a reasonable resolution of the claims alleged in the government's complaint. Judge Henson's voice carried the measured authority of someone who had presided over hundreds of such proceedings. The decree is approved and entered as an order of this court. The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the chamber, marking the formal beginning of federal oversight that would reshape the Carroll County Sheriff's Department for years to come. In the gallery, Nadine sat beside attorneys from the Civil Rights Division who had worked the case through its various stages. The victory, if it could be called that, felt muted. Consent decrees were frameworks, not solutions. They established requirements, but could not guarantee compliance. They created accountability mechanisms, but could not force institutional cultures to change. The real test would come in the months ahead, when federal monitors arrived to assess whether the department was actually implementing reforms or merely generating paperwork that simulated compliance. After the hearing, she stepped into the hallway and found Corinne Pratt waiting near the elevator bank. The GBI investigator had continued her work in parallel with the federal case, building the state-level documentation that would eventually support criminal prosecutions. "Consent decree's official," Pratt said. "That's step one. Step one of many. The U.S. Attorney's Office is moving forward on Beckford. Grand jury convenes next month." Pratt's voice dropped lower. "Obstruction charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Destroying the body camera footage was enough to establish the federal nexus." Section 1519. The destruction, alteration, or falsification of records in federal investigations. The charge carried up to 20 years, though actual sentences typically fell far below the maximum. More importantly, it established that Beckford's conduct crossed the line from administrative misconduct into federal criminal territory. And Vickers? suspended without pay pending the criminal investigation. His union's fighting it, but the consent decree gives the department authority to act on documented violations without waiting for prosecution. Pratt paused. The U.S. attorney is still evaluating whether to pursue charges or defer to state prosecution. Either way, his career is over. Over. The word carried finality that the legal process itself lacked. Vickers would likely never face trial, plea deals, deferred prosecution agreements, the various mechanisms that allowed the system to claim accountability without actually imposing consequences. But his badge was gone. His authority revoked. The power he had wielded over citizens like Keisha Whitmore would never be exercised again. What about Peniston? Pratt's expression shifted. Announced his retirement last week, full pension, no charges pending. The words landed with familiar disappointment. Peniston had been careful, always one step removed from direct involvement, always delegating the dirty work to subordinates who could be sacrificed when necessary. The evidence connecting him to specific violations was circumstantial at best. He would walk away with his pension intact, his reputation officially unblemished, his involvement in years of systematic misconduct never formally acknowledged. Insufficient evidence of direct involvement, Pratt continued, quoting language that had probably appeared in multiple internal memos. He kept his hands clean enough that prosecutors couldn't make a case. The system protects its own. The system protects those who understand how to use it. Pratt's voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent years watching accountability fail to reach the people who most deserved it. Peniston understood. Beckford was sloppy. Vickers was arrogant. But Peniston, he knew exactly how much distance to maintain. They walked toward the building's exit, passing through security checkpoints that scanned everyone entering but waved them through without inspection on the way out. The afternoon sun was bright, the Atlanta skyline visible through gaps in the surrounding buildings. "There's something else," Pratt said as they reached the sidewalk. The GBI reopened the Whitmore investigation. Nadine stopped walking. "Reopened? I thought the case was closed." It was, but the consent decree included provisions for reviewing cases that might have been improperly handled. Whitmore's accident fell within the scope. Pratt pulled out her phone, scrolled to a document. Federal forensic specialists examined the vehicle. The brake line damage wasn't wear, it was deliberate. Someone cut them partially, enough that they'd fail under pressure, but not immediately. The implication settled over Nadine like a physical weight. Not an accident. Not driver error. Murder, disguised as mechanical failure, committed 17 days after Keisha filed a complaint against the officer who had brutalized her. Do they know who? Not yet. The vehicle was serviced 3 days before the accident at a shop in Cartersville. The records show routine maintenance, but the mechanic who signed off on the work left the state 6 weeks later, moved to Florida, hasn't been located. A mechanic who disappeared. Service records that showed routine work while concealing sabotage. The careful orchestration of a death that would look like accident to anyone not searching for evidence of foul play. Someone paid him. Almost certainly, but proving it requires finding him, getting him to talk, establishing the chain of payment. Pratt pocketed her phone. That's months of work, minimum, maybe years. Years. The timeline of justice stretching forward while Keisha Whitmore remained in her grave, her death officially attributed to driver error, while someone who had arranged her murder walked free. Her mother deserves to know. Dorothy Whitmore, lives on the east side of Cartersville, same house Keisha grew up in. Pratt handed over a slip of paper with an address written in neat handwriting. She's been calling the GBI every week since the investigation reopened, asking if there's news, asking if anyone's going to tell her the truth about her daughter. Nadine took the paper, folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket alongside the other documents she carried. Consent decree excerpts, case file summaries, the accumulated evidence of 14 months spent documenting a pattern that had cost at least one woman her life. I'll go see her. That's not part of your official duties. No, it's not. Pratt nodded once, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. Some obligations existed outside official duties. Some debts could only be paid through human connection rather than legal process. The afternoon traffic moved through Atlanta's streets with the particular aggression of a city that had outgrown its infrastructure decades ago. Nadine retrieved her car from the parking garage and began the drive northwest, toward Cartersville, toward a conversation that no amount of professional training could fully prepare her for. Dorothy Whitmore's house sat on a quiet street where the trees had been growing for 50 years, and the homes reflected the modest prosperity of families who had worked hard for everything they owned. The lawn was neatly maintained despite the Georgia heat. Flower beds lined the front walk, displaying the careful attention of someone who found comfort in cultivation. Nadine parked at the curb and sat for a moment, gathering herself. She had delivered difficult news before, to families of victims, to witnesses whose testimony had triggered retaliation, to people whose lives had been damaged by the failures she documented. Each conversation required its own preparation, its own calibration of honesty and compassion. The front door opened before she reached the porch. Dorothy Whitmore stood in the doorway, a woman in her early 60s whose face carried the particular grief of parents who outlive their children. She wore a house dress and slippers, the uniform of someone not expecting company but always prepared for news about her daughter. "You're from the government." Not a question. Dorothy had learned to recognize the particular bearing of federal employees, the careful way they approached, the credentials they carried. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Nadine Hollister. I'm with the Department of Justice." "You're the one who filed the lawsuit against the Sheriff's Department." Dorothy's eyes held something that might have been hope, might have been suspicion, might have been the complicated mixture of both that defined relationships between black communities and federal authority. "I saw it on the news." "May I come in?" The living room was small but immaculate, decorated with photographs that traced Keisha's life from infancy through adulthood. School pictures, graduation portraits, a wedding photograph that showed Keisha in white beside a man Nadine did not recognize, both of them smiling with the unguarded joy of people who believed the future held only good things. "That's Marcus, her ex-husband." Dorothy noticed where Nadine's attention had landed. "They divorced in 2021. He moved to Chicago afterward. Couldn't handle being in Georgia anymore, he said. Too many memories." "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to explain why I'm here." "You're here to tell me what happened to my daughter." Dorothy sat in a chair that faced the photographs, positioning herself so Keisha's face remained visible throughout the conversation. "The GBI called last week, said they found something with the brake lines, said it wasn't an accident." "That's correct. The federal forensic team determined that the brake lines were deliberately damaged. Someone cut them partially, in a way that would cause failure under stress." The words landed with the weight they deserved. Dorothy's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles whitening with pressure, but her expression remained controlled. She had been preparing for this confirmation, Nadine realized. Had known, on some level that defied official findings, that her daughter's death was not the accident investigators had claimed. "She called me, you know, the night before she died." Dorothy's voice carried the particular steadiness of someone who had repeated this story many times, to many people who had not believed her. "Said she was scared, said she thought someone was following her. I told her to go to the police." The irony was devastating. Go to the police, the institution whose officer had brutalized her, whose investigators had buried her complaint, whose members may have arranged her death. "She filed a complaint against Officer Vickers, 17 days before the accident." "I know. I was with her when she wrote it. Helped her describe what happened because she was shaking so hard she could barely hold the pen." Dorothy's eyes remained dry, but the effort of maintaining composure was visible in every line of her face. "They hit her head against the car, left a bruise that took 3 weeks to heal. And when she complained, they killed her for it." The accusation hung in the air, stark, direct, unsoftened by legal qualifications or evidentiary limitations. Dorothy Whitmore did not speak in terms of allegations and investigations. She spoke in terms of truth as she understood it, Her daughter was murdered for the crime of demanding accountability. Mrs. Whitmore, I cannot tell you who killed your daughter. The investigation is ongoing, and we haven't identified the person responsible for the brake line damage. Nadine leaned forward, meeting Dorothy's eyes directly. But I can tell you that the GBI has reopened the case. Federal resources are supporting the investigation, and the consent decree we just obtained includes provisions specifically designed to prevent what happened to Keisha from happening to anyone else. Will it bring her back? The question required no answer. Both women sat in silence, surrounded by photographs of a life cut short, contemplating the inadequacy of justice that arrived too late to protect the person it was meant to serve. No, Nadine said finally. Nothing will bring her back. But it might bring answers. And it might prevent the next family from sitting where you're sitting, asking the questions you're asking. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, walked to a small table near the window, and retrieved something from a drawer. A photograph, smaller than the others, showing Keisha in what appeared to be a hospital room. She was going to have a baby, 8 weeks along when she died. The autopsy confirmed it. Dorothy handed the photograph to Nadine. 2 lives, not 1. They took 2 lives. The photograph showed Keisha smiling, hand resting on a stomach that showed no visible sign of the life growing within. The date stamp in the corner read, November 27th, 2023, 2 days before she died. Nadine held the photograph carefully, aware that she was touching evidence of loss that no legal process could address. The consent decree would reform a department. The criminal prosecutions would punish individual officers. But Keisha Whitmore would remain dead, and the child she had been carrying would remain unborn, and Dorothy would remain in this house, surrounded by photographs of a daughter who should have lived to raise that child. I'm sorry. The words were inadequate, but they were true. I'm sorry for what happened to Keisha. I'm sorry for what you've lost, and I'm sorry that the system that should have protected her failed in every way that mattered. Dorothy took back the photograph, looked at her daughter's face one final time before returning it to the drawer. Find the person who did this. Not for me. I'll be dead before any trial happens, probably. Find them for Keisha, so she can rest knowing someone cared enough to keep looking. I will. The promise was not within Nadine's official authority to make. The Whitmore investigation belonged to the GBI with federal support. Her role in the consent decree case was concluding, her assignment transitioning to the next department in the next jurisdiction requiring federal attention. But some promises existed outside official duties. Some obligations demanded personal commitment rather than institutional process. She would find the person who killed Keisha Whitmore, however long it took, whatever resources it required. Dorothy walked her to the door. The afternoon had faded toward evening, the Georgia sky turning orange and purple as the sun descended toward the tree line. Ms. Hollister, thank you for coming, for telling me in person instead of sending a letter. It was the least I could do. No. Dorothy's voice carried certainty that left no room for contradiction. The least you could do was nothing. That's what everyone else did. You did more. That matters. The door closed behind Nadine. She stood on the porch for a moment, letting the evening air settle around her, processing the weight of the conversation and the commitment she had made. Then she walked to her car and began the drive back to Atlanta, carrying with her the memory of Keisha's smile and the promise she had made to a mother who deserved better than the justice system had provided. This case goes deeper than anyone expected. Subscribe now to see what they've been hiding all along. The consent decree's first monthly compliance report arrived 6 weeks after Judge Henson's approval. Nadine reviewed it in her Atlanta office, parsing bureaucratic language for evidence of actual reform versus performative compliance. The document ran to 43 pages, detailing the appointment of an independent federal monitor, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, the implementation of new body camera protocols requiring automatic upload to cloud storage that could not be locally deleted. On paper, the progress was substantial. In practice, the monitor's preliminary assessment noted concerning patterns of resistance among senior officers and implementation gaps in training requirements. Translation: the department was following the letter of the consent decree while undermining its spirit wherever possible. One paragraph caught her attention specifically. The independent monitor had flagged a personnel appointment that raised conflict of interest concerns. The department had named a compliance coordinator to oversee consent decree implementation. The coordinator, according to county records, was the nephew of the current sheriff, a relationship that may impact the independence of compliance assessment, according to the monitor's diplomatically phrased concern. One step forward, half step back. The rhythm of institutional reform playing out exactly as she had predicted. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Corinne Pratt. Grand jury returned indictment on Beckford, 18 U.S.C., Section 1519. Arraignment next Tuesday, bail hearing same day. The obstruction charge had held. The grand jury had found sufficient evidence that Beckford had deliberately destroyed body camera footage to impede federal investigation. Not the most serious charge available, but one that carried real consequences: potential prison time, certain career destruction, the formal acknowledgement that his conduct crossed lines that even the system could not ignore. She drafted a response. Any movement on the Whitmore investigation? The reply took several minutes. Mechanic located in Tampa. GBI agents interviewing this week. He's lawyered up, but the attorney is signaling cooperation in exchange for immunity. Immunity, the familiar bargain of criminal justice, trading accountability for information, sacrificing the small fish to catch the larger ones. If the mechanic cooperated, he would walk free despite having participated in murder. But his cooperation might provide the evidence needed to identify who had ordered the sabotage. The calculus was brutal but necessary. Individual justice for Keisha would remain incomplete, but the systemic accountability might extend further than it otherwise could. A knock at her office door interrupted her review. Marcus Webb stood in the doorway, the Carroll County attorney who had presided over the administrative hearing's collapse 4 months earlier. He looked older than he had then, the intervening months having added weight to his already burdened appearance. Mr. Webb, this is unexpected. I'm not here officially. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with whatever had brought him to her office. There are things you should know, things that didn't make it into the federal investigation because we didn't have evidence strong enough to present. She gestured toward a chair. Webb sat heavily, the posture of a man carrying secrets he no longer wished to bear. Peniston didn't just protect Vickers and Beckford. He ran the whole operation, had been running it for years, long before Vickers was ever hired. Webb's voice dropped, though the office was private and the door was closed. There's a fund, unofficial, fed by a percentage of civil settlement payments. Money that was supposed to go to the county's general fund, but got diverted through accounting tricks I still don't fully understand. A slush fund. For handling problems, witnesses who needed to be persuaded, complaints that needed to disappear, and when persuasion didn't work, Webb trailed off, the implication clear without explicit statement. Keisha Whitmore. I cannot prove it. But her complaint was different from the others. She had recordings, audio from the traffic stop that contradicted everything Vickers claimed in his report. If that audio had reached a courtroom... Webb spread his hands, the gesture encompassing everything that had followed. She was a problem that could not be handled through normal channels. Where's the audio now? Gone. Her phone was never recovered from the accident scene. The official report lists it as destroyed in collision, but the vehicle wasn't burned. The impact wasn't severe enough to destroy electronics. Webb met her eyes directly. Someone took it, before the first responders arrived, before the scene was secured. Someone who knew what was on that phone and what it would mean if it surfaced. The timeline crystallized in Nadine's mind. The accident. The immediate response. Someone arriving before official channels, securing the evidence that could have proven Keisha's allegations. the careful orchestration of a cover-up that began before her body was even removed from the vehicle. Who? I don't know, but whoever it was had access to the dispatch system. They would have known exactly when the call came in, exactly how long before units arrived. Webb stood, clearly preparing to leave. The dispatch records from that night are still in the system, but the original operator retired 3 months after Keisha's death, moved to Arizona. Took early pension. Another person who had disappeared. Another thread leading away from Carroll County, away from accountability, away from justice. Why are you telling me this now? Webb paused at the door. Because I spent 30 years serving this county, believing we were doing good work, protecting people, upholding the law. And now I find out that the whole time there was a machine running underneath everything, a machine that destroyed anyone who threatened it. His voice carried the particular grief of someone whose faith had been shattered. Peniston walks away with his pension. Vickers will probably plea to something minor. Beckford might do time, but he'll be out in a few years. And Keisha Whitmore is still dead. The system protects its own. The system protected them, but you're still fighting, still pushing, still trying to find the truth even when there's no career benefit, no promotion waiting, no official recognition. Webb's expression softened slightly. That matters. Even if it doesn't feel like enough, it matters. He left. The door closed behind him. Nadine sat alone in her office, surrounded by files and reports and the accumulated evidence of 14 months, contemplating the gap between the justice she had achieved and the justice that remained beyond reach. The prosecution of Trey Beckford proceeded through the federal system with the particular pace of cases that generate media attention. His attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, challenge jurisdiction, question the legality of the investigation that had produced the charges. Each motion was denied. Each delay was temporary. The machinery of federal prosecution ground forward with the inevitable momentum of institutional authority. The plea offer came 6 months after indictment. Beckford would plead guilty to obstruction of justice, accepting responsibility for the destruction of body camera footage. In exchange, prosecutors would recommend a sentence at the lower end of federal guidelines, 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He would also provide testimony regarding departmental practices, naming names and documenting procedures that would support ongoing investigations. The deal was pragmatic. A trial carried risks. Acquittal was unlikely but not impossible, and the resources required would divert attention from other cases. Beckford's cooperation would provide valuable intelligence about the broader pattern of misconduct, potentially supporting charges against others who had thus far escaped accountability. But it meant that the man who had buried Keisha Whitmore's complaint, who had supervised the investigation that should have held Vickers accountable, who had likely known about the plan to silence her permanently, that man would serve less than 3 years for his role in a system that had cost a woman her life. Nadine was not present for the plea hearing. Her role in the Carroll County case had officially concluded with the consent decree's approval, her assignment transitioning to a new investigation in a different jurisdiction. But she followed the proceedings through court records and media coverage, tracking the outcome of work she had invested 14 months in building. Beckford accepted the plea. The judge accepted the recommendation. 30 months, minus time served, minus good behavior credits. He would likely be released in under 2 years. The evening after the plea hearing, Nadine received an encrypted email from an address she did not recognize. The subject line was blank. The body contained only coordinates and a time. The following morning, 8 a.m., at a location in rural Carroll County that her mapping software identified as an abandoned factory near the county line. The message could have been a trap. Could have been someone seeking to harm the federal attorney who had dismantled their department. Could have been any number of threats that her work had generated over the years. But it could also have been information. The kind of information that came from sources too frightened to identify themselves, too compromised to approach through official channels, too invested in their own survival to trust the systems that had failed so many others. She went, alone, which was not advisable. Armed, which was permitted but rarely necessary. Arriving 30 minutes early to assess the location, identify exits, ensure that whatever awaited her could be faced from a position of relative advantage. The factory had been closed for decades, its windows dark, its walls gradually surrendering to the patient assault of weather and neglect. The parking lot held only weeds pushing through cracked concrete. No vehicles, no indication of human presence. At 8:12 a.m., a car appeared on the access road. Older model sedan, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that blended into any parking lot without attracting attention. It stopped 50 feet from Nadine's position. The driver's door opened. The woman who emerged was in her 50s, wearing clothes that suggested a professional position. Business casual, practical shoes, the uniform of someone who worked in offices rather than factories. She walked toward Nadine with the hesitant pace of someone fighting fear with determination. "Ms. Hollister, thank you for coming." "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I can give you." The woman pulled an envelope from her jacket, holding it between them like an offering. "I worked in the Carroll County Records Department for 23 years. I processed documents that were supposed to be destroyed, filed reports that were supposed to disappear, maintained systems that were supposed to be secure. And 3 days before Keisha Whitmore died, a vehicle service order was processed through the county fleet maintenance system. The order authorized brake inspection on a personal vehicle, not a county vehicle. Personal. The authorization came from someone with administrative access to the system." Nadine took the envelope. Inside, a single document, a maintenance authorization form, dated November 26, 2023, 3 days before Keisha's death. The vehicle identified was a Honda Accord, Keisha's car, according to the registration records in the federal file. The authorization signature was electronic, a digital code rather than a handwritten name, but the document identified the authorizing department, Sheriff's Administration. The code traces back to a specific login, an account that was created 2 weeks before this authorization and deleted 3 days after the accident. The woman's voice shook slightly, the fear she had been suppressing finally surfacing. The account creation and deletion were handled by the IT administrator, but the authorization itself, whoever used that account knew the system, knew how to make requests that would be processed without question, knew how to leave a trail that would be almost impossible to follow. Who created the account? I don't know. The IT records were purged during a system upgrade 6 months ago, but the authorization form survived because it was printed for the mechanic who did the work. Physical copy, filed in the maintenance department, overlooked when they were cleaning up digital records. She handed over another document, a printed copy of the same authorization, this one bearing handwritten notes in the margin. The mechanic's notes, documenting the work performed. Brake inspection per authorization, no issues found. But the federal forensic report had found issues. Deliberate damage, sabotage that would cause failure under stress. The mechanic did what he was told, signed off on work that was never actually performed or performed work that wasn't documented. The woman took a step back, preparing to leave. "I've told you what I know. The rest is up to you." "Why are you doing this?" The question stopped her mid-turn. She stood in the morning light, face half-shadowed, expression carrying the weight of years spent inside a system she now recognized as corrupt. "Because I processed Keisha Whitmore's death certificate, typed the words driver error into the system, filed it with all the other routine documents. And I've thought about those words every day since." Her voice cracked slightly. She deserved better. Her family deserves the truth. And I'm tired of being part of the machine that buried it. She walked back to her car, drove away without looking back. And Nadine stood in the abandoned parking lot, holding evidence that connected Keisha Whitmore's death to the Sheriff's Administration, the office that Peniston had controlled, the department that had protected Vickers and Beckford and everyone else who had operated within its corrupt structure. The trail led back to someone with administrative access, someone who knew the systems well enough to create and delete accounts without detection, someone who had authorized the sabotage of a woman's vehicle 3 days before she died. Peniston had retired with full pension, no charges pending, insufficient evidence of direct involvement. But this document changed the calculation. This authorization, traced through whatever records remained, might provide the direct connection that prosecutors had been unable to establish. Nadine photographed the documents, uploaded them to encrypted storage, forwarded copies to Corinne Pratt with a summary of what the records department source had revealed. The investigation was not hers to pursue. Her official role had concluded months ago. But the evidence she had just obtained would support the work of those whose jurisdiction remained active. The consent decree would continue for another 30 months. The Federal Monitor would document compliance and resistance. The Civilian Oversight Board would review complaints with varying degrees of effectiveness. And somewhere, buried in the digital archaeology of county systems, the truth about Keisha Whitmore's death waited to be uncovered. 8 months after the consent decree's approval, Nadine received a phone call from a number she recognized as belonging to the GBI's Special Investigations Unit. "Ms. Hollister, this is Special Agent Reynolds. We've made an arrest in the Whitmore case." She sat down, suddenly aware of her heartbeat accelerating beyond its typical steady rhythm. "Who?" "Marcus Peniston, retired lieutenant, Carroll County Sheriff's Department. He's being charged with conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. The authorization document you provided, combined with testimony from the mechanic who performed the brake line sabotage, established the chain of command. Peniston, the man who had walked away with his pension, the man who had protected Vickers and Beckford and the entire corrupt machinery, the man whose careful distance from direct involvement had seemed to guarantee his immunity." The mechanic testified. In exchange for reduced charges, he identified Peniston as the person who contacted him, arranged the payment, and specified exactly what work needed to be done to Whitmore's vehicle. Reynolds paused. He also provided documentation of 3 other incidents over the past decade, 3 other vehicles, 3 other accidents that were ruled as driver error, 3 other victims, 3 other families who had buried loved ones without knowing the truth about how they died, 3 more cases that would need to be reopened, reinvestigated, reconsidered in light of the pattern that was finally being exposed. The arraignment is tomorrow morning. Given your role in the original investigation, the U.S. Attorney thought you should know. Thank you. She ended the call and sat in silence, processing the news. Justice, real justice, the kind that held powerful people accountable for the deaths they had caused, was finally arriving. Not complete justice, not perfect justice, but more than the system typically provided. More than anyone had expected when she first arrived in Carroll County, pretending to be a project manager with migraines, documenting patterns that seemed impossible to disrupt. The following morning, she drove to the federal courthouse. Not as an attorney, her role was complete, but as a witness. Someone who had started the chain of events that led to this moment. Someone who deserved to see the outcome of work that had consumed 14 months of her life. The courtroom was crowded. Media filled the gallery, cameras prohibited but sketch artists capturing the scene for evening news broadcasts. Dorothy Whitmore sat in the front row, wearing black, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who had waited too long for this moment to react with anything as simple as satisfaction. Marcus Peniston entered in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals. He looked smaller than he had at the administrative hearing, the authority that had defined his bearing stripped away by circumstances, replaced by the diminished posture of a defendant facing charges that would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. The magistrate read the charges: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice. Additional counts related to the other victims the investigation had identified. Peniston pleaded not guilty, standard procedure, regardless of evidence, and bail was set at $2 million. He did not have $2 million. He would remain in custody pending trial, experiencing from the inside the system he had corrupted for decades. After the hearing, Nadine found Dorothy Whitmore in the hallway, surrounded by family members and supporters who had accompanied her to this moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dorothy turned. Recognition flickered across her face. The federal attorney who had come to her home, who had promised to find the person responsible for Keisha's death, who had kept that promise even when official duties no longer required it. You found him. The investigation found him. A lot of people contributed to building this case. But you started it. You're the one who kept pushing when everyone else wanted to let it go. Dorothy reached out, took Nadine's hands in her own. Keisha would have wanted to thank you. Since she cannot, I will. Thank you. For not giving up. For not letting them bury the truth along with my daughter. The contact was brief, a moment of human connection amid the institutional machinery of federal prosecution. Then Dorothy was surrounded by her family again, guided toward the exit, beginning the long process of grieving a daughter whose death was finally acknowledged as murder rather than accident. Nadine watched her go. Then she walked out of the courthouse into the Atlanta afternoon, carrying with her the weight of everything she had learned and everything that remained unresolved. The consent decree would continue for another 28 months. The Independent Monitor's next report was due in 3 weeks. The criminal prosecutions would proceed through their various phases: trials, appeals, the endless procedural mechanisms that separated arrest from accountability. And somewhere in the Carroll County Records Department, among the files that had survived purges and upgrades and institutional efforts to erase the past, other secrets waited to be discovered. The investigation had exposed one pattern of corruption. But patterns rarely existed in isolation. They connected to other patterns, other systems, other failures that had allowed misconduct to flourish unchecked for years. Nadine had finished her official work in Carroll County, but the unofficial work, the promise she had made to a grieving mother, the commitment to truth that had driven her into this profession, that work was never truly finished. 1 year after the consent decree's approval, Nadine sat in a Waffle House 14 miles outside Cartersville. The same booth she had occupied after her release from custody. The same view of the highway interchange where trucks and cars passed without awareness of the history that had unfolded nearby. Her laptop displayed the Federal Monitor's latest compliance report. The Carroll County Sheriff's Department had achieved substantial compliance with 73% of consent decree requirements. Body camera protocols were being followed. Use of force documentation had improved significantly. The Civilian Oversight Board was reviewing complaints with something approaching actual independence, but 27% of requirements remained unmet. Training programs had been implemented on paper, but not in practice. Supervisory review of arrests showed patterns suggesting resistance to the new accountability mechanisms. And the compliance coordinator, still the sheriff's nephew, continued to generate concerns about the independence of internal assessment. 1 step forward, half step back. The rhythm of institutional reform continuing exactly as she had predicted. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Tyndall. New FOIA response just arrived. You need to see this. The attachment was a series of emails, obtained through a request that had been pending for 11 months. The messages dated from November 2023, the month Keisha Whitmore died. Sender and recipient addresses were redacted, appearing as black bars where names should have been. But the @carroll.gov domain was visible on both ends. The first email, dated November 28th, 1 day before Keisha's death, from redacted@carroll.gov to redacted@carroll.gov. Subject, Whitmore matter. Handled, will confirm when complete. Per our previous discussion. The rest of the message was redacted, but handled and will confirm when complete carried implications that required no translation. Someone in county government had known about the plan to silence Keisha. Someone who was not Peniston, whose arrest had not produced cooperation sufficient to identify all participants. Someone who remained in their position, protected by redactions and institutional inertia, and the same systems that had shielded misconduct for decades. The second email was dated December 3rd, 4 days after Keisha's death. Completed as planned, no complications. Recommend standard protocol for follow-up. Standard protocol, the bureaucratic language of murder, dressed in terminology that could have described any routine administrative procedure. A third email from 2 weeks later. Monitor situation for 6 months minimum. If no federal interest develops, proceed to normal status. Federal interest had developed. Nadine's investigation had begun 3 months after these emails were written. Had the sender known? Had they adjusted their behavior, destroyed evidence, prepared defenses against the investigation they had predicted might come? The redactions prevented identification, but redactions could be challenged. FOIA exemptions could be litigated. The institutional shields that protected identity could, with sufficient legal pressure, be compelled to reveal what they hid. The waitress appeared with a coffee refill. The same woman who had recognized Nadine 3 months earlier, whose cousin had filed a complaint that went nowhere, whose family had experienced the same patterns of misconduct that had brought federal attention to this county. "You're still working on it." Not a question. The waitress had learned to recognize the particular focus that accompanied Nadine's visits. "There's more to find." "There always is." The waitress set down the coffee pot, lingered for a moment. "My cousin, the one who filed the complaint? She got a call last week from the Oversight Board. They're reopening her case. Said something about new policies, fresh review, wanting to make sure nothing was overlooked. Small victories. The incremental progress that consent decrees were designed to produce. One case at a time. One family at a time. One step forward, even when the steps back seemed to outnumber them. That's good news. It's something. More than we had before." The waitress returned to her rounds, leaving Nadine alone with her laptop and her files, and the redacted emails that represented the next phase of investigation. Somewhere in Carroll County, someone with an @carroll.gov email address was watching the news about Peniston's prosecution, reading the compliance reports, calculating how long they had before their name emerged from the redaction. The consent decree had 24 months remaining. The criminal prosecutions would continue for years. And the investigation into who else had participated in the pattern, who else had known about Keisha Whitmore, who else had been protected by the systems that were finally being dismantled, that investigation was just beginning. Nadine saved the emails to her encrypted archive, forwarded copies to Corinne Pratt with notes about the FOIA litigation that would be necessary to compel disclosure of the redacted names, began drafting the next request, the next motion, the next step in a process that had no clear endpoint. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, voicemail notification. She listened to the message twice. "Ms. Hollister, you don't know me. I work in Carroll County Records Department. There's something you need to see about the brake lines and who signed off on the maintenance report 3 days before she died. A different voice than the woman who had met her at the abandoned factory. A different source with different information. Another person inside the system who had decided that silence was no longer acceptable." She saved the voicemail, created an encrypted backup, forwarded it to her supervisor with a note requesting authorization to follow up. The machinery of justice moved slowly, but it moved, and every person who chose to speak, every document that survived destruction, every thread that connected to other threads, all of it accumulated into pressure that even the most resistant institutions could not indefinitely withstand. The consent decree covered 36 months. The investigation into Keisha Whitmore's death was ongoing. And somewhere in Carroll County, someone with knowledge of what had really happened was deciding whether to trust the system that had failed so many others, or to remain silent and hope that the truth would never emerge. Nadine closed her laptop, paid for her coffee, walked out into the Georgia evening where the sun was setting behind pine trees and the highway stretched toward horizons she could not see. The investigation was not finished. The truth was not fully revealed. The justice that Keisha Whitmore deserved remained incomplete. But it was closer than it had been. Closer than anyone had expected. Closer than the people who had arranged her death had believed possible when they authorized the sabotage of her brake lines and waited for the accident that would silence her forever. And Nadine Hollister, senior trial attorney, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, would keep pushing until every redaction was lifted, every participant was identified, and every person who had contributed to Keisha's death faced the accountability they had spent years avoiding. The consent decree was paper. The compliance reports were progress measured in percentages. The criminal prosecutions were accountability distributed unevenly across participants of varying culpability. But the investigation was ongoing. The truth was emerging. And justice, imperfect, incomplete, frustratingly inadequate, was nonetheless arriving. One step at a time. One document at a time. One voice at a time. Until the pattern was fully exposed and the machine that had destroyed so many lives was finally, permanently dismantled.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.